If people buy the raffle tickets, we will collect them tomorrow morning.
We have a common interest in supporting the United Nations, humanity, human rights, and so I'm very, very excited to welcome all of you. We are going to start the evening off with Ramesh Thakur, who is going to be introducing our keynote speaker, Kenneth Roth, who is the director of Human Rights Watch, and many of you read their important reports, so it's a key part of the international system. And so welcome, and I'm going to invite you to the front, and we'll do this as a very informal interview Q&A type of format. So welcome.
It's on, you can hear me? Great. As Jean said, my name is Ramesh Thakur. I'm a professor at the Australian National University in Canberra. More pertinently for purposes of this conference, I'm the editor-in-chief of Global Governance, which is of course the ACON's journal. The way we are going to do it is I'll just give a brief introduction, 5 minutes, combining the theme we are going to address and introduction to our speaker. And we are going to do this as an informal conversation where I'm going to pose a series of questions. We got in touch with each other yesterday, I think, or the day before, and decided this was a format that would work best and that Ken is most comfortable with. As a result, yesterday I thought about and drafted some questions, and as a courtesy I did send them this morning to Ken, so he's not completely surprised by that, but he hasn't had that much time, too much time. Not surprisingly, the theme is human rights, and the rise and diffusion of human rights norms and conventions, and the extension and diffusion of international humanitarian law were, I think, amongst the truly major achievements of the last century. And the United Nations was at the center of that effort by constructing a treaty structure in which these principles were embedded and led to the establishment of many human rights institutions alongside intergovernmental machinery. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights inscribed around 30 human rights standards to give content to the abstract principle and norm. Because all states like to project themselves as being good, few are prepared to stand up against human rights. And there has been considerable normative and institutional advances in the decades since 1948. But I think it's fair to say that even in 1948, at the time of the Universal Declaration, few, if any, of the 50 voting for the Declaration would have believed in the total package that they adopted in 1948. And there was therefore reluctance to making human rights norms specific, legally binding, and enforceable. As a result, few states that endorse human rights in principle failed to break these commitments when any of these proved inconvenient. And unfortunately, my government is not immune to this. For the first time, I've begun to understand how it was possible for the Nazi regime to be in power and to be doing what they were doing, and people to go along by pretending not to know what was happening, because we are subjecting people, including children, to what amounts effectively to torture, and most of the population is prepared to go along with that and doesn't want to know about that. This is in terms of the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees. leaving all that. One of the important point I do want to make from my convictions, if you like, is that although the Universal Declaration has its roots in European foreign practice, more as a revulsion against European practice leading up to and culminating in the Holocaust, than as implementing the virtues or institutionalizing the virtues. The principles that are in there are remarkably common to all the major religions I can think of as well. And they're also common to the socialist tradition and legacy arising out of European thought and practice. And I say that because even as we move to a multipolar or polycentric world or multiplex world, whichever phrase you use, it does not follow that the human rights norm is necessarily under threat. In fact, it is much better suited and adapted to that. Nonetheless, there have been many reverses over the past decade or a bit over a decade, not the least because of the recalibration of relations between national security in dealing with terrorist threats and human rights, protecting civil liberties, using administrative practices, if not changing the laws, and somewhat paradoxically also the tension between some long-established human rights core principles and anti-discrimination legislation, which again brings back group rights and things there. So in all this, NGOs have performed an important role as monitors, watchdogs, trying to hold both governments and intergovernmental organizations feet to the fire of commitments and values that they have signed onto. Because, as I said, states are less eager to create enforceable police and judicial machinery than to embrace human rights in the abstract. One of the key NGOs active in the field, amongst the most prominent, the most visible, has been Human Rights Watch. And the public face of Human Rights Watch, seemingly forever, if I may say so, has been Kenneth Roth. We've seen him on TV, we've heard him on the radio, we've read him in the opinion columns of the world's leading newspapers. We've made use of the reports coming out of Human Rights Watch. And tonight, we are of course privileged to have him with us in person. Will you please join me in welcoming him to this event? He has to leave, he says, sharp at 8 o'clock. We'll see how much we can go by initially with the conversation, and time permitting, we'll open it up to the floor as well. But I want to start off with an ease into the conversation with a nice and soft question, but a very interesting one to me. And that is, Ken, what got you interested in and involved in the human rights advocacy?
Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here and to see all of you. And I do apologize, I've got to catch a plane tonight, so I should leave a little bit before 8 o'clock. So I'm going to sort of speak and run, but I offer my apologies in advance. But Ramesh, to answer your question, I mean, everybody has their personal reasons for doing this. In my case, it actually had to do with the experience of my father. My father fled the Nazis as a young boy. At the age of 12, he fled Frankfurt, Germany, after basically 5 years of trying to get out, and was able to escape to New York with his immediate family. And so I actually grew up with Hitler stories. My father would cut the hair of me and my brothers, as we were little. And to keep us quiet, he would tell us stories about what it was like to grow up in Germany. And at first when we were little, they were funny stories about the horse who delivered meat from my grandfather's butcher shop. But as we got older, it was about what it was like being a young boy under the Nazis and how scary that was. And so I kind of grew up with a sense of the evil that governments could do. I went to law school very interested in doing human rights work. I think in part because I was in law school at the time when Jimmy Carter was president, and he introduced human rights as an element of U.S. foreign policy for the first time. And I wanted to do something I believed in. I wanted the international work because it was sort of the new frontier. And so that's kind of what I decided I wanted to do. It then started out very inauspiciously. I signed up for the one human rights course on offer at my law school each year. It was canceled each year. I then graduated and there were no jobs whatsoever. Human Rights Watch had 2 employees. So I started volunteering. I worked as a lawyer. And I spent nights and weekends doing human rights work as a volunteer. And did that for 6 years. Until finally I got a phone call, there's this job at Human Rights Watch, would you be interested in applying? And I jumped on it. And I've been there ever since.
Well, I find that fascinating. I mean, just think of some of the major movements and some of the major advances and the story of individuals and their life stories and how that feeds into linking the personal with the global. You've just given us your story. Think of Peter Benenson and Amnesty International, think of Henri Dunant and the Red Cross movement, think of Raphael Lemkin and the Genocide Convention. You cannot separate the personal narratives from their efforts to improve the world for all of us. Now, you've been with Human Rights Watch for almost 30 years. In that time, from that vantage point, how would you describe the major changes in the human rights landscape over these last 30 years?
Well, Ramesh, I can answer that in a couple of different ways. First of all, if you look at the movement, I think the big shift in the movement has been the communications revolution. Because, when the human rights movement, the modern human rights movement, really started with amnesty in 1961. And at that stage, they were dependent on letters. It was too expensive to make international phone calls. So they would literally write letters, did you hear what happened to your uncle? And they'll send it off to Guatemala or whatever, and wait 3 weeks or 2 months for it to come back. And it was, it was a much slower pace. That was faster than it used to be. If you think about the origins of the human rights movement, when news traveled by steamship, you couldn't deal with individual cases. You couldn't even deal with sudden atrocities. You could only deal with big, large-scale problems. So, the slave trade, or women's suffrage, things that were campaignable over years and decades. That was the early human rights movement. It was modern postal service that made Amnesty's form possible. I remember when I got started, the fax machine was this incredible innovation. Now, why is that? Because for a 1-minute phone call, which maybe you could afford, you could send a page or 2 of information, and it would get there instantaneously. And that was radical. And we would smuggle fax machines into the Soviet Union. It was transformative. And of course, today there was email. We ran the landmines, which was the first kind of global campaign made possible by email, because it enabled us to build initially a global coalition of NGOs, and ultimately a coalition of about 60 governments, and communicating with each other on a daily basis, en masse, using email, which was just not possible even a few years before that campaign. And today, I guess the big innovation is social media, because it's inconceivable today to say something like the Khmer Rouge atrocities could take place in obscurity, where people really were not sure what was happening. Today everybody has a mobile phone, everybody can take pictures, and everybody is a publisher through social media. So these are big transformations of the movement, which I think has strengthened us substantially. Obviously the world is very different, and in the time that I've been doing this, I've seen huge improvements in parts of the world, and ongoing serious problems. If you look at Latin America, for example, when I started, it was mostly military dictatorships. Today, despite a few holdouts, it's mostly fairly thriving democracies. You could say, look at Eastern Europe, which was communist dictatorships, and today is many members of the European Union. Eastern Asia looks very different. Southern Africa looks very different. But then there are parts of the world that don't look that different, or indeed have gotten somewhat worse. The Middle East is much more tumultuous now than it was a few decades ago. Central Asia, sadly, is too unchanged. Parts of Central Africa are much more deadly today than they were. So, and I think, that's sort of what I expect. I mean, I have never been one who believes that human rights progress is linear, because I think that governments are always tempted to violate human rights. And the role of the human rights movement is to increase the cost. You assume the governments have a degree of rationality to them, and there are benefits to violating human rights. It's a way of getting rid of the opposition. It's a way of favoring your own ethnic or religious group. And governments will tend in that direction unless you shift the cost-benefit analysis. And that's what the human rights movement does. We add reputational costs and sometimes other costs to those who violate human rights, trying to tip the balance in favor of more consistent respect. So, I'm never one who thinks the human rights movement is just going to go away, that, we'll get, kind of human rights paradise at some moment, and that'll be the end. We're always going to be, there's always going to be a need for a human rights movement to push back against this governmental temptation.
I'm glad you ended up where you did in answer to that question, because, of course, you mentioned social media as having empowered the human rights movement and empowered activists in various ways. But, of course, technology has also empowered the national security state in its efforts to oppress and repress, and the whole rise of the surveillance state in the very country in which we are having our meeting. Bearing all this in mind, what, from your personal and/or institutional point of view, are the top 3 contemporary human rights challenges that you are grappling with?
Well, I mean, one maybe to lead off your question, Ramesh, is there really is a global crackdown today on civil society. And that is very much a product of social media. I mean, if you think, what is civil society? It's people banding together to make themselves heard. People speaking as individuals have a hard time being heard or noticed. When people band together as a group, as an NGO, as a civil society organization, they're much more likely to be heard. And what we've seen, say beginning about 5 years ago, you can perhaps mark it with the Tahrir Square revolution in Egypt, is that civil society has been super empowered by the emergence of social media. Because suddenly, not only can they be heard by the traditional media more effectively, but they've proven capable of deploying large numbers in the street by using Facebook or Twitter. And that, if you're an autocrat, the scariest thing in the world is to find large numbers of people in your capital protesting against you. And that has led to a preemptive effort by a range of governments around the world to try to restrict civil society. And it these days is typically taking one of 2 forms. There is a proliferation of sort of overbroad laws, frequently billed as counterterrorism laws, that are then used to shut down civil society for somehow endangering national security. So that's a big trend. The other thing that we're seeing is that governments are trying to starve civil society groups of funds. And they do that because in more autocratic countries, it can be dangerous to be a human rights donor. Because the people who are wealthy enough to be a significant donor have business interests which are vulnerable to retaliation by a government that doesn't want a well-funded civil society. So it's not that hard to shut down domestic sources of funding. And now what we've seen is a range of governments also trying to cut off funding from abroad. And they do this, under the guise of, we want to avoid this foreign interference in our domestic affairs. I mean, you know the rhetoric. But the same governments who are actively soliciting foreign investment, and they're actively soliciting foreign trade deals, and they're actively soliciting foreign aid in the development or humanitarian field, suddenly object to foreign funding of an NGO that is there to try to hold them to account, whether an environmental group or a human rights group, but anybody who's monitoring and criticizing the government, suddenly that's interference. And we're seeing almost an epidemic of these kinds of laws. So, I mean, that is, maybe I'll end there because it's much longer, but that's a big problem that we're facing right now. But obviously we can talk about, the methods of warfare, we can talk about the refugee crisis. I mean, there are a number of other things to do.
Reflecting back on your time with Human Rights Watch, as I said, 3 decades now. What, in your view, has been the biggest achievement by Human Rights Watch, or the source of biggest satisfaction to it in that time? That really gives you pride.
Yeah, I mean that's a lot of the day-to-day work is very fulfilling. I mean, if you get somebody out of prison, if you get a government to change a law, I mean, there are these day-to-day victories that happen. We just last week celebrated the conviction of Hissan Habre, who had been the dictator of Chad, had gone into exile in Senegal, and had evaded justice for some 2 decades. We're working on that case for 14 years, collecting evidence, pushing in various fora to get him prosecuted, working with the Chadian victims. And finally, a Senegalese court convicted him. The first time universal jurisdiction has ever been used by one state to convict the head of state of another. So that was a big one. But as I think back, it tends to be the big standard-setting moments that you remember. So Human Rights Watch shared in the Nobel Peace Prize for the campaign that led to the treaty against anti-personnel landmines. We then did the same thing with cluster munitions, and were able to push through a treaty banning those, another form of indiscriminate warfare. We were the key actors behind the protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, banning child soldiers. We played a very instrumental role in the Rome Statute, launching the International Criminal Court. So there are certainly standard setting or institution building moments that are big moments, because you're kind of building the foundation for the movement.
And the flip side of the same question, what has been the source of biggest regret or the most significant failure or the biggest defeat, whichever way you want to phrase it?
Yeah. I mean, today I am preoccupied by Syria. And it has been a failure because we have not succeeded in changing or even curbing the Assad government's attacks on civilians. I mean, what makes the Syrian conflict so unusual? I mean, every war is ugly. Every war involves killing. But in most wars, the Geneva Conventions have some meaning. And the essence of the Geneva Conventions are basically you spare civilians as much as possible the hazards of war. And certainly you never target civilians. I mean, that's the most basic of war crimes. And what the Assad government has done is essentially ripped up those rules and has chosen to fight this war by deliberately targeting civilians in opposition-held areas. And the idea is to depopulate those areas, to send a lesson to people, if you let the rebels take over your village will be destroyed. And so they've dropped, the paradigmatic tool they've used is the barrel bomb, which are these oil canisters, oil drums, filled with explosives and shrapnel. They are utterly unguided. They basically are loaded into helicopters which fly above the anti-aircraft range. And then these drums are just rolled out the hatch. They tumble down to earth, it takes about 30 seconds to hit the ground. I've had people describe to me the terror of those 30 seconds because it always looks like it's going to land on you. And it's only in the last few seconds you realize that it's going to just miss you, you hope. But these have been dumped on hospitals, on schools, on markets, on apartment buildings, and they have devastated neighborhoods of Aleppo and Idlib. And this is what Assad is doing at this point with the active support of Iran, Hezbollah, and foremost, Russia. Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, one of the leading states, is the reason today Assad is able to pursue this war crime strategy of fighting this war. And that's why he's able to barrel bomb people, that's why he's able to besiege civilian areas, that's why he's been able to maintain tens of thousands of people in his prisons where they're dying rampantly of torture and execution. And our inability to put enough pressure on Putin to stop Assad is, for me, a huge disappointment. And at this stage, we have a major source of worry and discontent.
You mentioned earlier Amnesty International at the start of the modern human rights movement in 1961. How do you distinguish Human Rights Watch from Amnesty with regard to goals, mission, work methods, strategies you use, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, we're in many ways very similar. We're very close allies. I mean, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty are the two big global groups. They're a lot bigger than we are. They're basically 5 times our size in budgetary terms. But we are, we're pursuing very much the same agenda. And we often work together. There are lots of friends back and forth. I think the biggest difference is methodological. And it's not a clear distinction, but Amnesty is foremost a mass movement. And the way it gets things done is by mobilizing its membership to write letters, to send emails, to protest, And given that methodology, its reports are written primarily for a mass audience. Human Rights Watch has never really tried to replicate Amnesty's mass membership. I mean, there's kind of no point in doing that. It's very, very expensive to build and maintain. And so we've pursued another approach. And that is we try to put governments really in one of two ways. First, we try to shame them in the press. And so we put enormous effort into writing for the global media and getting them to publish our findings. And in a typical day, there will be 80 to 100 unique articles about Human Rights Watch's work around the world. So we're able to put a very kind of intense spotlight on governments, and fortunately they find that very shameful. Coming back to your point, Ramesh, everybody pretends to respect human rights. That's an essential element of their legitimacy, but in fact we know they fall short. And we, by investigating and highlighting that discrepancy, we generate pressure on them to change. The other thing that we do is that we have set up a series of offices in influential capitals and cities around the world. So, obviously in Washington, in Europe, we have major operations in Brussels for the European Union, in London, in Berlin, in Paris. We have big operations here in New York and in Geneva for the United Nations. But we've become increasingly global in this respect. We have similar advocacy offices now in Tokyo, in Sydney, in Delhi, in Beirut, in Nairobi, in Johannesburg, in Sao Paulo. And the aim here is to figure out, which relationships does a target government care about. And we then try to use that relationship to influence its behavior. Sometimes just through diplomatic pressure, sometimes by trying to condition things that they want. Maybe you're not going to get your next arms shipment until you stop using those arms to kill civilians. Or you're not going to get your next big tranche of budgetary support unless you stop the torture. Or sometimes less tangible things. You're not going to get invited to this fancy summit where you get to be seen with other heads of state and get nice photos for the folks back home unless you release those political prisoners. But we always try to figure out what do people care about, and then we will influence those policy relationships to try to maximize pressure for change. And so, these are areas where Amnesty does work, but sort of with much less of an emphasis. And if you look at a Human Rights Watch report, they really are written for journalists in the quality press and for foreign policy or public policy professionals, because they're aimed to kind of pursue our methodology rather than the mass mobilization that is the bread and butter of Amnesty. So that really is kind of the key difference between the two.
Thanks. As you know, this organization is about people interested in studying the UN system, and we also have, including in the audience, present or past very senior members, Koba, Ibrahim Gambari, Sugi Hasegawa there, others that maybe I can't see with my fading eyesight as well. The next series of questions I want to ask about the UN and your relationship and your assessment of the UN. Start with the general one. What is your relationship with the UN?
But we work with the UN all the time. And when you talk about the UN, there really are in essence two UNs. There's the UN, the conference room, and there's the UN, the operational agencies. And you have to kind of make that basic distinction. Now, the UN, the conference room, the two conference rooms we pay the most attention to are the Security Council in New York and the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Those are the two fora where our issues tend to come up the most. Sometimes the General Assembly, but less so. In the case of the Security Council, it's, we're dealing really with atrocities and armed conflicts and efforts at accountability. Those are the big issues there. So, for example, it was, maybe 8 months ago or so ago, we were very worried about what was happening in Burundi, a country that nobody pays any attention to. The president, Nkurunziza, suddenly decided that he was indispensable and the country could not possibly survive if he didn't change the constitution to enable him to have a third term, which he did. That prompted protests. He started shooting the protesters, and suddenly it looked as if there may be an ethnic dimension that would emerge. Burundi has a very similar ethnic makeup as neighboring Rwanda, roughly 50% Tutsi, 85% Hutu, and people were worried, oh my goodness, is this going to spiral into a genocide? And nobody was paying attention. So that was an example where we were quickly mobilizing the information and deploying it, not only with the African Union and Addis, but also with the Security Council in New York, and we're able to convince the Security Council ambassadors to actually get on a plane and fly to Bujumbura as a way of making clear that the world was watching and there was not going to be an opportunity for mass atrocities in obscurity. So that's kind of an illustration of what we would do there. The Human Rights Council, we are working there all the time, and work obviously to try to get resolutions adopted addressing particularly troublesome situations. But we also work with the special rapporteurs. We work with the various treaty bodies that also happen to be based in Geneva. We work very closely with the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where obviously we're moving now more into operational agencies. In terms of the agencies, I think the ones we work most closely with are the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the High Commissioner for Refugees, peacekeeping, and the Secretary General's office himself, because we often enlist the good offices of the Secretary General to try to address particularly sensitive situations.
Okay. Again, spinning off from that, as you know, being based here, the politics of the global North-South divide sometimes threatens to leave the UN totally dysfunctional. How do you respond to the charge that organizations like Human Rights Watch are de facto part of the soft power armory of the global North? I'm sure that has come up in your experience often enough.
Well, first, I actually don't accept that human rights are a North-South issue at all. I've spent a lot of time in the global South. I find very few people who want to be summarily executed. I don't really bump into people who want to be tortured.
It's not about the human rights norm, it's about the organization, the Human Rights Watch as an organization.
Yeah. Well, in other words, where I'm starting is that your premise is that human rights are a North-South issue. I don't buy that for a second. And in fact, even at the governmental level, while you obviously have governments in the North and the South that are trying to, in a sense, compromise the ability of the United Nations to enforce human rights norms, you also get governments on both sides of that divide who are very strong allies. And if you just look at the voting record in places like the Security Council or the Human Rights Council, it doesn't break down North-South at all. Indeed, one of the first things that we do when we're pushing an issue is to ensure that we have sponsors and supporters in all regions of the world. In terms of Human Rights Watch, our headquarters are here, but we're very much a global organization. We have 77 nationalities on staff. We have people based in 45 countries, working on 90 countries. If you say, who is the face of Human Rights Watch in India, it's Meenakshi Ganguly, an Indian. Who's the face of Human Rights Watch in Russia is Tanya Lapshina, our Russia director. And I can go around the world and say very similar things. I was just in Brazil last week, and Ria Lara Canaseu is our director there. So we are a global organization, and everybody's got to be based someplace, but we uphold global norms, and we do it with a very diverse staff.
Good. You mentioned the Human Rights Council. It's 10 years since it was set up. How do you assess its performance?
Well, it may be worth taking a step backwards and remembering why we have a Human Rights Council. Because it was a bit over a decade ago where there was a consensus that the predecessor, the Human Rights Commission, was not working. And the reason it wasn't working is because the stigma of being condemned by the Human Rights Commission was so powerful that we saw a range of abusive governments flocking to get on the commission in order to try to stifle its voice. And it had become sort of a club of dictators, which was not in the least bit concerned with promoting human rights. And so the move to the council was an effort to influence the membership and to try to upgrade the membership somewhat. And that's been a mixed bag. One of the tools used was to try to have open elections. Now, unfortunately, many regions have stymied that too, because rather than putting forward a competitive slate which enables the members of the General Assembly to vote for the best handful to be members of the Council, we find a majority of the regions today putting forward a so-called clean slate, but probably the more appropriate name would be a dirty slate, given the purpose, because it deprives you of the vote. There are 3 openings for Africa, they only put forward 3 candidates, and you see things like that replicated around the world. So that has made it harder. Now, that said, there have been almost every year there's been some utterly inappropriate government that vies for candidacy on the council, which we've been able to defeat. But not always, because of the subterfuge of the clean slate. In terms of the working methods of the council, it has improved over the commission. One tool that's been very useful is something known as Universal Periodic Review, or UPR for short. And what this means is that every government gets reviewed at least once every 5 years. So there's no more selectivity in that respect. And it's not necessarily the deepest review, but it means that, for a day or so, you are there answering questions from your peers. And of course, civil society works very closely with governments to supply them with the information needed to ask intelligent and probing questions. In the course of that questioning, governments are asked to make various commitments to improve. There's then an opportunity to follow up. So that has been a useful tool. In terms of the appointments of rapporteurs, the adoption of resolutions, the council still is very politicized. So, if you are a relatively unpopular government, you can still be criticized. But if you're, Egypt, you escape despite, the worst crackdown in the modern era under the Sisi government. If you are Saudi Arabia, nobody touches you, even though the air coalition you've been leading has been responsible for 60% of the civilian deaths in the Yemen war. There are certain countries that remain untouchable, and this is very much a failing of the Council, even in its current incarnation.
Another issue that's been around for a long time that leaves all UN officials deeply embarrassed and ashamed. I remember an Amnesty report from early 90s or mid 90s on human rights abuses by UN peacekeepers, so it's as old as that at least. It's come up in our deliberations here again. Why is this problem so intractable? What can we do about it? It's deeply frustrating to all of us.
No, the reason it happens is because, the UN, when it comes to finding peacekeepers, still sees itself as the supplicant. It's begging governments to contribute peacekeepers. And governments basically say, we'll give you peacekeepers, but only on the condition that we get to judge our own if there is any abuse. And so, we saw this recently in the Central African Republic, where there were serious abuses by a number of the contingents there, some UN, some AU. And the UN, by virtue of the deal it struck with the contributing countries, was unable to prosecute any of these people. It had to send them home and hope that the contributing country would pursue it, and needless to say, a lot of them don't. In fact, it's difficult for them to do it because, let's say there was a rape allegation in Bangui, in the Central African Republic. So the troops are sent back to Brazzaville. Prosecutor in Brazzaville gets the case, and they say, well, where's the witness? Where's the evidence? Oh, it's back in Bangui. Not the easiest case to make. And so one thing that we've proposed, and in fact I just met with Jane Lute-Hull, who is the Secretary General's designee to try to address this problem, is, what I suggested to her is that part and parcel of the deployment of a peacekeeping force, even if you have to stick with the idea of promising that the UN wouldn't prosecute itself, that it would keep prosecution in the hands of the contributing country, the UN can at least make it difficult for the country to ignore that. And there are a few things it can do. One is it should deploy a prosecutor and investigators with every peacekeeping force. Now, they won't have the capacity to prosecute on their own, but they can make the case. If there's a rape, they interview the woman, they interview the witnesses. They put together all the evidence, and then they say, here's the ready-made case. So, okay, you're going back to Brazzaville. Here, prosecutor, here's the evidence. And here's how you get in touch with the women, and this is how you can pursue the case if you are conscientious about this. You then follow up. And you should be publishing on a regular basis in a very visible place what follow-up there was, and use the shaming capacity of the United Nations to make clear when governments are or are not serious about holding their peacekeepers to account for war crimes or other atrocities. And if steps like that were taken, we would see a real diminution in cases of abuse by peacekeepers.
And finally, as we come to near the end of his term, how would you assess Ban Ki-moon's record in promoting, defending human rights? If you want to answer that question.
Sure.
Irina can close her ears if she doesn't want to be part of this conversation.
No, I mean, I'm sure.
Go ahead.
Ambassador. No, it's it's a mixed bag. I mean, I think Ban Ki-moon is fairly conscientious about his desire to promote human rights. He's not been terribly effective in using his voice publicly in a way that really attracts attention. And some of that, frankly, is just personality and manner. Some of it is, not figuring out the ways to speak, to be heard. He has developed this concept of human rights up front, which I very much hope that the next Secretary General continues. And the essence of this, I mean, what sparked it was the experience of the United Nations in Sri Lanka. The UN always has a lead agency in charge of its presence in a country. And typically, 50% of the time, or if not more, it's the UN Development Program, UNDP, that is the res rep, the resident representative of the United Nations. And UNDP, being a development agency, prioritizes good relations with the government. And it never facilitates good relations with government to be speaking out about its human rights abuses. And so there's this natural tendency on the part of UNDP res reps to downplay human rights issues. And the most appalling example of this occurred in Sri Lanka a few years ago, where in the waning months of the war with the Tamil Tigers, the Sri Lankan military was indiscriminately shelling a spit of land along the beach where tens of thousands of Tamil civilians had congregated along with members of the Tamil Tiger fighting force, and 40,000 civilians were killed. And while this was unfolding over a series of months, the res rep, the UN representative, said, "Oh, we can't talk about this because we might get kicked out, and we need to maintain our relations with the government." And so it was appalling, and they basically put a premium on presence rather than voice, when in a situation like this it should have been the opposite. There was a report written about this, it's called the Petrie Report, and that prompted Ban Ki-moon to say, this is not what the UN represents, this is not what we stand for. And he has this concept, human rights up front, which is designed to guide people in the field, that when they are facing these kinds of dilemmas, they opt for doing the right thing in human rights terms, even if that means making relations with the host government more difficult. Now, I give him great credit for that. That's the right thing to do. And I hope that this is a legacy thing that survives and that the next Secretary General takes it up.
It's 2 to 8. You have to rush. You have to rush.
Oh, I do. I definitely do.
Yes. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, you found it as interesting and fascinating as I have. He's been given us his views with the typical candor that we expect from Ken, and we've covered a fair bit of ground. Before he goes, would you please join me in thanking him most warmly?